get into finishing the notes on the second half of page 8 through page 9. So, just a quick reminder, the Crusades were a series of religious wars fought between the Christians of Europe and the Muslims of the Middle East. This was fought over a region of land called the Holy Land. The Holy Land was right over here. So it's the region right over here. The city of Jerusalem was kind of the epicenter of this. It was a city that was once controlled by the Eastern Orthodox Christians of the Byzantine Empire, but the Seljuk Turks, which is an ethnic group who happened to also be Muslim, invaded into Byzantine territory and took control of the Holy Land, specifically the city of Jerusalem, as well as cities of Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, these places, right? So it was holy to Christians, Muslims, as well as Jews. Christians believed it's where Jesus Christ was killed by Romans and then came back to earth, came back to life after several days. Muslims believed it's where their holy prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven, and Jews had Jerusalem as actually it was their city. They founded it as the capital of their kingdom of Israel. All right, so going back, so the Muslim Seljuk Turks, they conquered the area, and the Seljuk Turks in particular were a very militant group, and they refused to let Christians come to the Holy Land on religious pilgrimages. The Byzantines were afraid that the Seljuk Turks were going to attack their capital city of Constantinople. The result was Commodus, the emperor of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Empire of the Byzantines, asked Pope Urban II, the leader of Catholic Christians in Europe. Remember, Eastern Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians, they have disagreements over several things, such as who's the leader of the religion. The Catholics believe it's the Pope. Eastern Orthodox believe it's a figure called the Patriarch. The Catholic Church believes that all sermons, all prayers must be done in Latin, whereas Eastern Orthodox believe it should be done in Greek. So there's several disagreements. So the Eastern Orthodox Christian Emperor Commodus asked the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban II, for help. Pope Urban II, in 1095, issues a decree and order that Deus Vult, God wills it, and he tells all Christians that basically if you're a good Catholic Christian and you go, your duty is to go to the Middle East and conquer Jerusalem and put it back in the hands of Christians. If you do this, all sins will be forgiven, and you'll be allowed entry into heaven for all eternity. All right. So the First Crusades ended in 1099, so 5 years after Pope Urban II announced it. The Crusaders made it all the way to Jerusalem, and by some miracle actually retook it. This created the Crusader states, but they were vulnerable because they were surrounded by Muslims. So by 1144, one of them was conquered by the Muslims. From 1147 to 49, we had the Second Crusade launched, which failed miserably. This is where we left off on our last video. So Christians responded in 1187 after the Muslims had taken over the city of Jerusalem again. The Christians responded by sending kings from their three most powerful empires or kingdoms down to Jerusalem. And each one took a different route. So we've got King Philip II of France. King Philip II of France, he took this red line. So he kind of took boats down through this way. That's where his soldiers were going. That's the route his knights took. Emperor Frederick of the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, he took also a sea route. And then there was Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England, who took a land route down there. So these were going to be the three kings. Let me move this so you can see King Philip II of France. So these three kings of separate kingdoms were all Catholic Christian kings. And they were going to go down to the Middle East, answer the call of the Pope in the Third Crusade, and take Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land back from the Muslims who had conquered it. Well, they kind of had some issues. So first and foremost, Philip II of France, he argued with Richard, the King of England, and decided to take his toys and go home. Frederick, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, drowned along the way. That left one king left, King Richard the Lionhearted of England, and he took command of all the Christian armies in the Middle East during the Third Crusade. So Richard the Lionhearted, extremely important historical figure. Key things you need to know about him: 1, he was the King of England. 2, he was actually the king in the during the time of the stories of Robin Hood. Right, so if you know the stories of Robin Hood, Richard the Lionhearted was actually the king of England at the time that story was supposed to take place. He was a very courageous leader, very charming, extremely ruthless, but also a brilliant military mind. So this guy, he, much like Alexander the Great, a lot of courage, fought with his soldiers, so they respected him. He's very charming, so he was said to be able to basically talk people into anything. But at the same time, he was ruthless in that he killed a lot of innocent people just to get his point across. So that he was the leader of the Christian army. On the Muslim side, defending their homelands, because remember, this is the Muslim homeland Christians are coming in and invading, was the king Saladin. Saladin was known because he was extremely religious, so he was a very good Muslim. He followed the 5 pillars of Islam, if you remember that from our first our world religions unit. Even Christians had to admit that he was extremely honest, so if he said he was going to do something, he was going to do it, and that he was extremely brave. So much like Richard the Lionhearted or Alexander the Great, millennia before him, he was known for fighting with his troops. He didn't just stand back and watch the fighting. He actually took part of it and was extremely brave. Also, much like Richard the Lionhearted on the Christian side, Saladin was a brilliant military tactician. So here's the problem. You've got 2 great leaders. You've got Richard the Lionhearted on the Christian side leading the Christian crusading knights. You've got Saladin on the Muslim side leading the Muslim warriors. Both are brilliant military leaders. Both are great fighters. Both are extremely brave. So who's going to win this fight? That's the answer, right? Who's going to win it? Well, unfortunately, we can't watch these videos because it echoes too much. We'll watch them in class. Richard the Lionhearted and Saladin, after several years of fighting, realize no one's going to win this war. So they come to a truce in 1192, and the Third Crusades ends with Saladin and Richard the Lionhearted striking a bargain. Saladin was allowed to keep control of the Holy Land, so the Muslims kept control of Jerusalem, Tripoli, and all the holy cities in the Middle East, but in exchange for the Christians to stop fighting. The Saladin agreed to allow any Christian pilgrim to come down to those holy cities to visit Christian holy sites anytime they wanted, as long as they did not bring weapons. So this was the truce that ended the Third Crusades. Saladin and Richard the Lionhearted kind of fought to a standstill, and in the end, they agreed that the Muslims would keep control of the Middle East and the Holy Land, but the Christians would be allowed to come down and visit holy sites as long as they were unarmed. So this is kind of the deal they struck. That didn't, of course, end the Crusades because there was a 4th Crusade a few decades later. The 4th Crusade was actually famous for the fact that it never actually even made it to the Holy Land. We'll learn a little bit more about this in our lessons. So it never actually got to the Holy Land. Instead, the Christian knights made it to the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople right here. And instead of continuing on, they waited around to be paid for services, and when they didn't get paid, they basically rioted and stole everything of value. So there you have it. 4th Crusade ends in a huge failure and weakened the Christian city of Constantinople to the point that, spoiler alert, eventually it falls to the Muslim Turks and becomes the Ottoman Empire. We'll get there in future lessons. So quick recap of the 4 Crusades so far. First Crusade, huge success. Christians take back the Holy Land. Second Crusade, huge failure. Third Crusade, fought to a standstill, but I think we can agree it's probably a good agreement that the Muslims keep control of the Holy Land, but allow Christians who are unarmed to come and visit holy sites. So good, kind of a good truce there. 4th Crusades never actually made it to the Holy Land and wound up actually ransacking and stealing and extremely weakening the Byzantine Empire. But we're not done with Crusades, because there in 1212 Common Era, there was the Children's Crusade. This was where over 50,000 children answered the call of the Pope, believing that they were being led by God and protected by God, and they marched all the way to the Holy Land was their goal. They did not bring weapons because they believed God would protect them. The result of this was many died along the way. So these were kids your age or younger marching to the Holy Land thinking that they can conquer it without weapons because they have God's protection. Most died. Many others were sold off into slavery. So Children's Crusade after the 4th Crusade, which failed. Children's Crusade failed even worse. So you can kind of see things aren't going so well. All right, let's talk about the impacts of the Crusades. So why are they important? Because they kind of set up the future. So they increased trade with the rest of the world, with Europe. So during the time of the Roman Empire, remember, there's the Silk Road connecting India and China to the Middle East, which connected to Rome, which connected and also connected to the African empires throughout Africa. During the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was cut off from all that trade. The Crusades reconnected Europe to all those products and all those things and all these kingdoms that for hundreds of years they had lost access to. Right? Europeans were exposed to sugar, which they could not get enough of, right? So candy, cotton for softer clothing, silk, right? From China, spices for their foods to make it taste better because they didn't have refrigeration, so meat went bad. So spices kind of covered up that rotten taste. Other things that happened. Well, in the Middle East, Crusaders found access to improved technology, right? So they had better boats were built in the Middle East, right? So they had access to designs for better boats that could sail faster and further. The sails, those cloth things that catch the wind and push boats. They figured out that in the Middle East, they had this new type of sail called a triangular sail that caught wind better and moved ships faster. They also discovered in the Holy Land detailed maps of the Eastern Hemisphere, Asia, Africa, and they realized the world was a lot bigger than they thought. Now, at this time, again, no one knew really, at least no one in the Eastern Hemisphere knew that North and South America was over to the west. The Vikings had discovered it, but they kind of realized there's nothing here of interest, so they left and went home, didn't really tell anyone about it. So now we have detailed maps, and Europeans can kind of see what else is out there. Feudalism also begins to decline because of the Crusades. So the lords who had sent many of their sons down, many of them themselves had went down because, remember, the Pope promised them all sins would be forgiven and they'd go to heaven if they fought in this war. So many of the lords who controlled the fiefdoms were now dead, which left kind of peasants with, okay, who are we going to serve? The Byzantine Empire was highly weakened, right? Remember, the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire, and they kept a lot of the knowledge of Rome alive, while all the rest of Western Europe forgot how to speak Latin, forgot how to read Latin. Most people didn't know how to read and write. So the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, vastly weakened. Remember, the Fourth Crusades ended with European Christian knights ransacking the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. There's also a lot of increased animosity between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, right? This is a couple hundred years of wars, right? There are at least 4 numbered crusades plus the Children's Crusade. And this resulted in a lot of hatred, animosity, hatred, and anger between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Now you might be asking, well, why Jews? Well, because it happened that the Christian knights on their way down to the Middle East, to the Holy Land to fight Muslims, would kill as many Jews as they could find as well, right? So Europe has a long history of anti-Semitism, which is basically racism toward people of the Jewish faith. And so this just increased the animosity between these 3 groups. This increased the persecution of Jews throughout Europe, right? Everything was always blamed on the Jews in Europe. That was kind of the final big thing here. So this sets up what we call the Age of Exploration coming up, because now Europeans have a taste for sugar, cotton, silk, and spices. They want access to it. They now have access to better technology, boats, sails, compasses, maps, so they can get to these other places, and they're kind of wondering, well, what else is out there? What else can we find? What else can we take? Feudalism, the way that Middle Ages and Dark Ages had kept order, was weakened because peasants were dying, lords were dying, so that system had to be shaken up. The Byzantine Empire, the most powerful empire in the region, vastly weakened by the Fourth Crusade and all these wars. The Seljuk Turks pushing on their territory. Christians, Jews, and Muslims started to hate each other even more, and Jews in particular were treated like absolute crap. So that's kind of how we're going to end here. Make sure you have your pages 8 through 9 done. Rewatch this if you need to in order to get more information. Contact me if you have questions.